last time, we began getting into the heart of Romans. And we saw that the reason that Paul was not ashamed of the gospel is that the gospel is actually the power of God, the dunamis of God for salvation. It's the same power that literally took a dead Jesus and made him alive. It's an unstoppable power that makes sure that we are saved to the uttermost through all the stuff that we go through. And in the end, we win. The game is fixed in our favor. Well, today, Paul continues in verse 18. And he says, "For in it," I'm talking about the gospel, "the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. As it is written, the just shall live by faith." And that's actually kind of a summary statement for everything Paul's going to be talking about for the next 8 chapters. So let me read it one more time. "For in it," talking about the gospel, "the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. As it is written, the just shall live by faith." So the gospel shows us how the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. Now, what does that mean? Well, that's what Paul's going to start explaining here. And he's going to do it one step at a time for the next 8 chapters. And the very first thing that Paul begins with is actually some bad news. Do you ever have somebody tell you, "Look, I have some good news and some bad news. Which one do you want first?" Well, I'm the kind of person that wants to hear the bad news first. Tell me the bad news and then tell me something that's going to make it better. And this is actually what Paul does. He gives some bad news first. And he says this, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness." Well, that's a pretty startling way to begin a conversation. Wrath of God seems a little harsh, but it's actually really, really important. And here's why. Until you understand how bad the problem is, the solution just won't make any sense. Let me give you an example. My dad told me a story about my grandpa. My grandpa went to the doctor one day because he could sense that he was losing circulation in his hands. And the doctor did all kind of tests, and he came back and told my grandpa, "You're going to have to quit smoking." And my grandpa said, "Oh, Doc, I can't quit. I can't do it. It's a habit. I like it. I just can't." And the doctor said, "Well, I'll tell it to you like this. You can stop smoking, or the next time I see you, I'm going to have to cut your hand off. And then after a little while, I'm going to cut your arm off. And as the circulation continues to be a problem, I'll have to cut your legs off." Well, that little speech scared my grandpa right out of smoking, and he quit on the spot. He embraced the solution because he really understood how bad his problem actually was. And Paul is about to start with a huge problem, which is ungodliness, he says, and unrighteousness, which is sin, and everybody's got it. And he says everybody is suppressing it, holding it down, denying it, pretending it's not there. It's being stubbornly ignorant. You know, I don't have a problem. Everything's fine. But Paul says, no, it's not fine. There is a disease there, and it's a really big deal. It's a big problem. And in chapter 1, Paul's going to take aim at the heathens, the unreligious people. And in chapter 2, he's going to talk about the Hebrews, the good people, the goody two-shoes. But in the rest of these verses here, he's talking about the heathens. These are the pagans who are not Christian. They don't pretend to be Christian. They don't pretend to be moral. Paul says this about the heathens in verse 19. For what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. In other words, they couldn't have known about God through the law of Moses, what we call direct revelation, because they didn't have that. But they knew about God from creation. And that's what he says in verse 20. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes are clearly seen. In other words, you can clearly see that there is a creator. Paul's saying, come on, stop pretending. Stop suppressing the truth. You know that there is a creator. You know that there is a God. Being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they, talking about these heathens, so that they are without excuse. The reality of creation, just the very fact that we exist, I mean, stars, the grass, the galaxies, creation is screaming about the reality of God. And to deny that, what do you have to do that? You have to stubbornly hold down the truth. That's what Paul's saying. Now, why would somebody do that? Why would somebody suppress a truth that is so obvious and that is so important? Well, Paul continues in verse 21. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. If there is a God, then they are owned by that God, like we said a couple of days ago. God made me, I belong to him, just by virtue of creation. So they feel a responsibility to the one who actually created them. And they didn't want that, Paul says. In verse 22, professing to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. Notice how, even though they refused to worship God, they actually still needed something to worship. Human beings have an unstoppable impulse to worship something. We are all going to find something to worship. And if it's not God, it'll be a job or a relationship, something that is the whole center of your world, and you will sacrifice everything for that thing. Whatever that is, in the center of your life, you might as well call it a God. We must worship something. Some people worship sports. Sports teams can have players that have an almost God-like status. I brought some pictures here just of some sports fans, and I want you to look at this. This is a really great illustration of worship. Giving their whole selves to a team, screaming, turning their bodies into a billboard. Just a comparison here. I think that maybe our society hasn't evolved as much as we think that we have. The point is that we're all going to find something to worship. And the question is, are you giving glory and thanks to the one who actually created you? The only one who deserves all of your attention, all of your loyalty, all of your gratitude. Paul says that the pagans, they knew who to thank. They knew who to worship. But they just refused to do it. And instead, they found something lesser to worship. It's called ungodliness, unrighteousness. And Paul's going to continue with this thought next time. Hey, it gets worse before it gets better, but there is a solution that's coming, and it's amazing. It's going to knock your socks off. Just remember that we're talking about the gospel here, the good news. But first we have to understand the problem, and we'll continue with that next time. See you then.